Everyone, welcome back to JP's Budget Collecting and our weekly look back at the hot comics from 6 months ago. This week we're looking back at the hot comics from December 23rd, 2022, and I'm recording this on June 23rd, 2023. Had to think about that for a second. Today is the 23rd, so I'm recording this on Friday. You guys will see this on Saturday. As always, I give you those dates so you know when this information is actually most relevant. As always, also, we're looking back at the CBSI Hot Top 10 and the Comic Tom Key Collector Hottest Trending Comics of the Week for that period when we're looking back. We use those two lists because each week they put out a list of 10 comics that are hot or trending in the market, that are jumping in value, that are jumping in sales. And we see what we can learn from looking back at them 6 months to see how they've responded in the market since. Would you have been better off being patient? Was it worth going after? And what factors make some books worth it and some books worth being patient for? I can't hardly talk today, but we're going to keep trying to plug through this. So that's what we're trying to do here. And see what we can learn. This week we got 16 books to talk about. So let's dig in and see what we can learn. First up, we have Warhammer Monthly number 0. And this basically is the first kind of Warhammer, and it's a magazine comic. And basically this hit the list because Henry Cavill is, I guess, attached to the production. They're talking about making this into a show, I believe. So with him attached, that is where this is coming from. Back then, sales were literally all over the place. $10 to $100 plus for raw sales. They're supposedly including a $998 sale, which just seems crazy. An 8.5 went for $150 back then. So this book was a little bit all over the place, pretty wide range. Now it's a $25 to $90 book, so still a very wide range on raw sales here. And it's not 100% being driven by condition, although some of it definitely is. But there are some cheaper sales that are fairly nice copies too. So it's a pretty wide range here. Overall, back then, obviously, if you paid $9.98 for one or well over $100 for one, then it's a trap. But the vast majority of the sales were not in that range. So we're going to call this kind of steady. I'll be back because we're within the range. But you've probably been better off just being patient and finding an opportunity. Although you wouldn't necessarily have saved a lot if you didn't pay on the top end back then. Next, we have God of War number 1. This hit the list because it was officially ordered for series, at Amazon. So they are going to make this into a show. Back then, cost copies of this jumped to 80. 9.8s were doing $3 to $350. Under 10,000 printed on this one, so it is a little bit hard to get on this one, or a little bit limited, not hugely. And now raw copies are $100 to $200. Although 9.8s have actually stepped back, $275 to $325, kind of in the same range. But most of the sales are still raw copies, and those have definitely jumped. So we're going with up and straight cash on this one just based on those raw sales. We've since gotten some additional news about that this is coming. It continues to kind of move forward. So with that somewhat steady news related to the series, this book has managed to maintain pretty well and actually continue to increase a little bit in value. All right, with that, we're moving into our covers, and we got 2, 4, 6, 7 covers this week to talk about. First up is Dark Ride number 3 on the list for the second week in a row. This is the Tony Flex 1 in 25. Last week when we talked about it, it was 40 to 50, so not even quite, just barely getting up to double ratio. By the second week, it had jumped all the way up to 60, so just slightly over double ratio. Still not a good sign for a 1 in 25. That's really not high enough for it to sustain, and this one didn't. It's a $15 to $40 book. 9.8, only one sale went for $80. So this one's definitely turned into a trap. Most of those sales are kind of in the $20, $30 range. So definitely a trap, borderline dumpster fire, depending on where you buy, where the range is here. But yeah, definitely a trap on this one, and one that would have been way worth being patient on. Next, we have Weird Science Fantasy number 29. So I guess this was referred to, as they put on the list, as a long overlooked Frazetta cover. So this is a Frank Frazetta cover that is somewhat hard to find. Back then there was a couple of sales, all 400 plus for this book, which caused it kind of to be put on the list. Since then, I think more people have put this book on the market and tried to make some money off of it, which has kind of driven prices back down. $150 to $350 for this one. on the range of prices here. Again, this book is old enough, definitely condition driven for sure on that 150 to 350. But overall, we're going to kind of call this a trap. Prices are definitely down, and it doesn't appear to be quite as hard to find as maybe people thought it was, which has led to prices being a little bit lower. Next, we have The Mandalorian, number 6, the Raza 1 in 50, also on the list last week. This 1 in 50 last week, though, was only going for right around ratio at 50 to 60, which is not a good sign. By the week 2, it had jumped all the way up to 80, which means still not even double ratio, which is still not a good sign for a 1 in 50. But what it is a dumpster fire, because now it's $20 to $50 book, 9.8, 135 to 140. Just a couple of sales there, but yeah, 20 to 50. Most of the sales, $30, $40, so 50, 60% reduction in price. Definitely a dumpster fire on this one. Next, we have Catwoman number 50, the Sozumaki 1 in 50 foil variant. This, I believe, was her last cover on the book after her short run of doing variants. Obviously, there is a non-foil version of this, which was like the B cover, and then they did this 1 in 50 foil. This 1 in 50 foil was going for 80 to 90 back then. Now it's a $50 to $100 book. 2 9.8 sales, 120 and 200, so big range on those two. I've said I'll be back then. I kind of stick with that, steady, and I'll be back. Not a ton of sales here, and it kind of all throughout this range. But yeah, a little wider range, but you can definitely get it lower than the 80 to 90 it was back then, although there are still some sales there. So we're going to lean toward the steady, I'll be back. You can maybe claim down and I'll be back. But this book is definitely more affordable most of the time than it was back then. Next, we have Batman, Superman, World's Finest, number 10, the Paul McCartney variant by Dan Mora. Another one of these music artist variants that which people were like, oh, kind of based on the Biggie variant and the Eminem variants that had recently come out that we'd been talking about. Because this one, which was just a regular variant, it's up to a $20 to $40 book. Raw copies back then were going... Yeah, raw copies $20 to $40. People were jumping on this. It has not sustained that. It's now a $15 to $25 book, which for a regular variant is still really good for a new book without really any key factor, but not near what it was then. 9.8, 50 to 100, so pretty good range on that also. So we'll call this a down and I'll be back. I predicted trap here. It didn't quite back up enough to call it a trap, but definitely down and I'll be back. Dark Crisis on Infinite Earths number 7, the George Perez 1 in 350 foil variant is our next book. This was basically hit the list, was not that long after George passed. It was kind of a tribute variant to George, who did the original, obviously, Crisis on Infinite Earths. So for the wrap-up of Dark Crisis, they did a tribute with his art. Raw copies back then were going for $400 for this 1 in 350. Now, the raw copy of this sold recently, went for $300. There's not very, only 5 of these are listed, so they're pretty hard to find. I mean, technically, based on that price, you would call it a down and I'll be back. You could probably argue maybe steady / I'll be back because it's just one sale, but and the listings are all right in this range, if not higher. So not a ton of sales, not a ton listed. This seems to be a pretty tough book to get. May eventually become a bit of a ghost book, but yeah, cool Perez cover, but it is definitely not quite holding those crazy prices from the beginning. Our last cover is Marvel Treasury Edition number 8 from 1975. This is just a classic Christmas cover. Obviously, this was right at Christmas. If you know anything about these holiday or time of year variants, you know the worst time to buy them is at around the holiday. Back then, this one was going for $40 to $50 in December. Now it's a $5 to $20 book in June. Shocking when we're not thinking about Christmas. This book is not as popular. This is pretty typical. But the result is definitely a dumpster fire. If you paid $50 and now it's worth, or if you paid $45, now it's worth $15. Yeah, that's not the best place to be. So always buy holiday stuff away from the holiday. It's really the way to go about it in terms of comics. All right, with that, we got a couple of Comic Buzz books. We have Werewolf and the Society of Fearless Frontiersmen, number 1. And this, of course, is another Bad Idea book. We've talked about Bad Idea a lot on this list. Almost every time one of these comes out, it hits the list. Usually because Tom has put it there, but hits the list, and it's usually because it's selling, because people keep chasing these Bad Idea books, and they keep failing to hold. This one does not buck that trend. Back then, it was a $10 to $30 book raw right out of the gate. Now it's a $5 to $10 book, which is still more than cover, but not worth it if you're paying $20, $25, $30 for this. That's a dumpster fire, which is really what happens almost with all of these Bad Idea books. They do not have sustainable value. They have proven that over and over again. Next, we got our last Comic Buzz book is Tale of the Teen Titans, number 44. First, Dick Grayson as Nightwing, origin of Deathstroke. Back then, raw copies were going for $120, and 9.8s were going for $400. And this is really because the showdown between these two characters was the key event in Dark Crisis. So the finale of that crossover event had these two characters coming together. That's what caused this book to kind of hit the list. Now, raw copies are $25 to $125, depending on conditions. So, a little bit of it will be back there on the raw, maybe, but the high end is still right at the top. But 9.8s are actually $450 to $700, with most of the sales closer to the $450 side, but there was a $700 sale. More typically, it's been $450 to $5 or to $6, but yeah. Overall, so how do I judge this? Raws are backed up probably a little bit overall, particularly on average. 9.8s have pushed forward a little bit, so we're going to kind of call this steady, worth it. It's kind of in the same range in terms of the raw, with a little, but on the I'll be back side. On the 9.8, it's above the range, moved up, but not a ton of 9.8 sales, so we're going to call it steady and worth it. You can maybe argue maybe it's up, you can argue it's down, so that's where we're going to end up with. Next, we're going to do a whole bunch more of Sony Spider books. These are all stuff the second week after the trailer to Across the Spider-Verse dropped. So these were all books related to Across the Spider-Verse. And obviously we've just recently got that movie, so these books should be doing pretty well. So let's see how they're doing. First, we have Vault of Spiders number 1, the first appearance of Spider Bite, a character we did get in Across the Spider-Verse. So that was why people were chasing back then. Back then, it was a $15 to $20 book, raw, 9.8 going for $80. Now it's a $5 to $25 book. Sorry, 15 to 20 back then. Now 5 to 25. 9.8 still have pushed up to 1 to 125. So this one's probably been steady, worth it, I would call it again. Covering that same range on the raw side with occasionally a sale higher, occasionally a sale lower. But the 9.8s have definitely pushed forward a little bit. So we're going to call this steady, worth it side of things. But I would guess 6 months from now, probably going to be able to do a little better than you can do right now. So, but right now, it's definitely still considered worth it. Next, we have Spider-Woman number 1, the first solo title and origin of the first Spider-Woman, Jessica Drew. Obviously, we got a version of Jessica Into the Spider-Verse movie, or Across the Spider-Verse movie. Back then, this book was going for $75 on average on Raw. 9.8 is going for $280. Now it's a $10 to $45 book on Raw side. That $75 seems really high. This book has rarely produced that kind of value just because there's a lot of them. 9.8, $2 to $300. So Raw side, that's down in a trap from that 75 for sure. 9.8 side, that's, kind of maybe steady, I'll be back. But there are not that many 9.8 sales, so we're gonna base this based on the Raw side and say trap and down. But yeah, a character we got, a book that I appreciate because it's a birthday book, but yeah, this is a great character. So next we have Amazing Spider-Man number 149, the first appearance of the Spider-Man clone, who much later gets retconned as Ben Reilly. At this point, during this book, he's never named. He's just the clone. Back then, raw copies were going for $180. 9.4 was going for $525. Now, raw copies go for $20 to $80. 9.4 going for $600. So, huge drop on the raw side. 9.4 creeped up a little bit. Based on looking at sales across this is clearly one I think where I failed to double check Tom's average value on the raw side. And I think that 180 is probably high. As I looked across sales for different grades of slab copies, It was pretty much steady, kind of worth it, which is what that 9.4 value was going for. So I didn't write it down anything different, but my guess is that average was too high because they have a tendency to do that, include like slab sales on those averages sometimes. So I'm going to say steady and worth it overall for this one, just based on what I'm seeing with the slab sales. Net and my uncertainty about what was going on with the raw sales. Next, we have Web of Spider-Man number 118. First, Ben Reilly as Scarlet Spider. Back then, raw copies were doing 100, 9.8 doing 700. Now, raw copies are 20 to 100, with 9.8s doing 550 to 900. So we're definitely steady on the 9.8 side. Maybe I'll be back, maybe worth it, because it's kind of expanded beyond that range. But the average is still about 700. Raw side's, again, down a little bit, but not a lot. Most of the nicer copies are still going up for around $100. So another one we're going to call steady and worth it here. Ben Reilly has been able to keep these books kind of moving and staying pretty steady. He's been in the... They've used him in the comics quite a bit recently, and obviously he was in the movie, so that's pretty much sustained the values here. And then our last book of the week is Spectacular Spider-Man number 24, on the list for the second week in a row. The first appearance of Hypno Hustler. Now, this does not have anything to do with Across the Spider-Verse, but had everything to do with Sony announcing they were going to make a movie based on this character, which just made me feel like they were trolling Marvel. Last week when we talked about it, it was 35 to 100 for raw, 9.8 to 70. By this point, it was 50 to 70 for a raw copy. 9.8 is going for 500. Yeah, now a raw copy is 5 to 30. 9.8, 250, and that's only based on one sale. This is a dumpster fire. I predicted that back then. I don't expect them to actually, kind of like El Muerto that we've heard they're not actually going to make that movie now. I don't expect them to ever actually make this movie either. I'd be stunned. Especially seeing as the whole thing that was driving this was people were thinking Donald Glover was attached as Hypno Hustler, and then they just used him in Across the Spider-Verse as clearly a version of the Prowler. So... yeah, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So, yeah, definitely a dumpster fire here on this one. So that is this week's list. Only 16 books to talk about. Mostly down and steady. Quite a few steadies again. We've been getting a lot more steadies here recently. I think the market's starting to bounce, like level out a little bit from the went crazy high, came crashing back down, and starting to level out a little bit, which is causing us to see a few more steady books here in recent weeks. But still, most part, you're better off being patient. So I want to thank you guys for watching, and we will catch you next time.